Sigmund Freud, considered by many to be one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, is in the tradition of Plato and Shakespeare in that he stimulates our thinking about human nature and life. When we use expressions such as, "let's get beneath the surface," or "more than meets the eye," we're talking Freud's language. This is the second in a series of programs I'm doing on Sigmund Freud, and the programs are entitled Freud's Lessons. Allow me to provide a brief review of the last program. I pointed out that Freud was born in 1856, 4 years before Lincoln was elected president. And Freud died in 1939. At that time, Franklin D. Roosevelt was president of the United States. So Freud's life spanned approximately the time from Lincoln to Franklin D. Roosevelt. Freud spent more than 50 years studying the human mind, behavior, and human nature. He is considered to be the founder of psychoanalysis. And what is psychoanalysis? Psychoanalysis is the science of unconscious mental processes. Freud wrote many books. Among the most famous books he wrote were The Interpretation of Dreams, and a book he wrote late in life, which provides a very good overview of his work, a book entitled Civilization and Its Discontents. Professor Harold Bloom, who has written extensively on Freud, claims that Freud was one of the great essayists in the Western tradition. He also sees a connection between Shakespeare and Freud. Professor Bloom points out that Shakespeare was Freud's favorite writer, and that indeed Freud read Shakespeare in English. Professor Bloom claims that Freud could never admit that so many of the ideas he expressed about human behavior were expressed by Shakespeare several centuries before. Today's program will focus on Freud's views on education, human relationships, and women. And also in this segment, I'll be dealing with some specific Freudian lessons, emphasis on ways Freud may be very relevant to our lives. And also, I'll be talking about what some of Freud's critics and defenders have said about him. And time permitting, I'll provide some suggested reading, books by Freud and about Freud. And now to Freud's views on education. Freud claimed that in his day, education gave young people a false psychological orientation. How so? Well, Freud contended that when he was alive, education concealed from young people the role that sexuality would play in their lives. Freud also contended that education did not prepare young people for the aggressiveness of which they were destined to be the objects. Let me give you Freud's own words. In sending the young out into life with such a false psychological orientation, education is behaving as though one were to equip people starting out on a polar expedition with summer clothing and maps of the Italian lakes. Freud also contended that education lies to young people about the ethics of adults. Again, Freud's own words. The young are made to believe that everyone else fulfills ethical demands. That is, that everyone else is virtuous. It is on this that the demand is based, that the young too shall be virtuous. Freud concludes that at least in his day, young people were unprepared for the degree of evil they would meet in the world after leaving school. There is a Freudian lesson here, I think. Freud stimulates our thinking about education. Why should we not require philosophy and psychology courses in secondary schools, for example? Do we do enough? Do we do enough in school to help students understand themselves and life? Allow me to give an example concerning history. I think it's true that too often history in our secondary schools and even in our universities is taught pretty much as a recitation of facts and dates. Tolstoy, the great Russian writer, said that the aim of history is to teach humanity and nations to know themselves. Again, Tolstoy claimed the aim of history is to teach humanity and nations to know themselves. If we were to use the Tolstoy approach to teaching history in our schools, I think one of the most common questions, perhaps, that a teacher or professor might ask about different topics is, what does this aspect of history tell us about human behavior or human nature? Allow me to give some specific examples. If, for example, a teacher is teaching American history and the topic is the American Revolution or slavery, a very appropriate question, I think, for the teacher to ask the students is, what does slavery, in your opinion, tell us about human behavior or human nature? If one is teaching the Constitution of the United States, a very appropriate question would be, what do you think our Constitution tells us about the Founding Fathers' view of human nature? What do you think the U.S. Constitution tells us about the Founding Fathers' view of human nature? Freud's basic lesson about education is this: facts are not enough. Facts are not enough. Students must learn to jump the gap from memorizing to thinking. They must learn to think critically. The aim of education is greater understanding of oneself, others, and life. Could such an education reduce the number of bad marriages in America and the incidence of depression? On the subject of human relationships, Freud claimed that all relationships, whether they be family, friends, lovers, are difficult. Freud claimed that other people are a source of both happiness and unhappiness in our lives. And Freud said that in virtually all relationships there is ambivalence. And what did Freud mean by that? He often used that word ambivalence, or at least the German word for ambivalence. Freud believed that there is a tense coexistence of love and hate in the human mind. Again, ambivalence is the tense coexistence of love and hate over the human mind. Freud believed that in virtually all relationships, in virtually all sentiments of love, there is both rage and hostility, as well as love. This would include, for example, marriage and friendship. Freud said that there is perhaps only one relationship that might be free of ambivalence, that might be free of rage and hostility mixed in with the love. And that relationship, he said, was the relationship of mother to son. Again, there is a Freudian lesson here, I think, and the lesson is that in our relationships, we should be prepared for ambivalence. For those of you who just tuned in, you're watching Life, Love, and Philosophy. Today's episode is entitled Freud's Lessons. This program can be seen regularly on Sundays on Channel 35 at 10 p.m. and it's repeated on Tuesdays at 8:30 p.m. also on Channel 35. Freud, on the subject of women, made many disparaging comments. Freud, for example, claimed that women show a greater capacity for jealousy than men. He also said that women show less sense of justice than men. And he also claimed that women's feelings impede their decision-making. Here are Freud's own words on the subject of women. Women show less sense of justice than men. They are less ready to submit to the exigencies of life. They are more often influenced in their judgments by feelings of affection or hostility. Freud made many disparaging comments about the feminist movement of his day. That's right, there was a feminist movement in the late 19th century and early 20th century when Freud was alive. And again, let me give you Freud's own words, his disparaging words about the feminist movement. A woman cannot earn a living and raise children at the same time. Women as a group profit nothing from the modern feminist movement. At best, a few individuals profit. Professor Peter Gay has written what many consider to be the definitive biography of Freud. Peter Gay is Professor Emeritus at Yale. And here is what Professor Gay has to say about Freud's comments on the feminist movement. Freud did not conceal his distrust of the feminist movement. The feminist movement would never win a recruit in him, despite all he was doing for it in his own profession. Let me read that last sentence again. The feminist movement would never win a recruit in him, despite all he was doing for it in his own profession. And what does Professor Gay mean by that? Well, Freud welcomed women into the psychoanalytic movement. He welcomed the idea of women becoming psychotherapists. In fact, one of the most famous psychotherapists of the 20th century was Freud's daughter. Anna Freud became a very famous child psychotherapist, so famous that late in life she regularly lectured at Yale, and at age 85, Anna Freud, Freud's daughter, was awarded an honorary doctorate degree by Harvard. Professor Gay continues in his comments about Freud and women. He says this: Freud's impolite attacks on feminists have not served him well. Freud's impolite attacks on feminists have not served him well. How does one account for Freud, regarded by many as one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, being so wrong-headed on the subject of women? Well, I think both Aristotle and Schopenhauer provide some illumination here. Aristotle said this: there is a foolish corner in the mind of the wisest man. And Schopenhauer, the famous German philosopher, said this. Schopenhauer said, every genius is in some way stupid. Freud believed one way in which women are like men is that they are sexual beings, and that consequently their neuroses, their mental disorders, originate in sexual conflicts. Which brings us to the heart of psychoanalysis. As you well know, or perhaps you know, Freud believed that there was an intimate connection between people's mental disorders, such as depression, for example, and sex. Freud believed that neurosis is the result of inner conflicts, often unconscious, involving sexual feelings or thoughts. Let me say that again. Freud believed that neurosis is the result of inner conflicts, often unconscious, involving sexual feelings and or thoughts. Let me give you Freud's own words. Neurotic symptoms are in their essence substitutive satisfactions for unfulfilled sexual wishes. Again, Freud's own words. Neurotic symptoms are in their essence substitutive satisfactions for unfulfilled sexual wishes. I must point out that Freud's view is still quite controversial. Freud's method of therapy, psychoanalysis, is often called the talking therapy. Freud believed that aided by a good therapist, talk can be healing. Freud believed that if people listen carefully to themselves, they can learn to understand themselves better and change for the better. Freud also predicted that someday chemical substances might be used to treat mental disorders. Of course, in those days, there was nothing such as Prozac, for example. But Freud did believe that someday chemical substances could be used to alter balances in the mind. What's the current thinking about the talking therapy versus using medication to treat neuroses? Well, I think it's fair to say that more than a few mental health experts today believe that the best therapy for mental disorders would involve using both the talking therapy and medication, that one may not be sufficient, that both probably are essential, or at least helpful. What was Freud's view of human nature? Well, let me give you some of the words, adjectives, that perhaps give us a good overview of what Freud's view was of human nature. Freud believed we human beings are complicated, we are aggressive, we are ambivalent in that we often love and hate the same person, we are unaware, we are unconscious, we are asleep in many ways, we are deniers and repressors. We often lie to ourselves. Freud, an atheist, sounds like Christ when he says that we are all sinners and we all have a dark side. Freud reminds me a little bit of the very famous French intellectual Blaise Pascal. Pascal claimed that we human beings have two natures, one good and one bad. Freud, like Pascal, believed we need to wake up. And how do we wake up? Well, we wake up through introspection, through examining our behavior, through examining our consciousness. And what are some aids to personal illumination? Well, among the things that can help wake us up are great books, great drama, Shakespeare, for example, great art, music, and of course therapy, psychoanalysis, for example, and therapeutic friends. And what do I mean by therapeutic friends? I mean friends who are both compassionate and good listeners. How do we get people to be better? According to Freud, how do we get people to be better? Well, it's very important that people think more clearly, because if they think more clearly, they'll see more clearly. And of course, one of the purposes of the talking therapy, of psychoanalysis, is to get people to think more clearly. Also, if people are to become better, if people are to become more decent, Jesus and Freud both agree that we must go to war against whatever is sick, whatever is bad in ourselves. Allow me to say that again. Jesus and Freud, the atheist, both agreed that if we human beings are to become more virtuous creatures, it's very important that each of us goes to war against whatever is sick, whatever is bad in us. The writer Willie Morris describes the gentle person and what the gentle person has done to become gentle. And I think Freud would agree with this. The writer, again, Willie Morris, says this: "The gentle person is the one who has warred the most against his own inner violence." Allow me to give you Freud's view of society. Freud believed that society is often irrational. After all, it's made up of people who are often irrational. I mentioned before that Freud very much liked Shakespeare. One of Shakespeare's plays that Freud most liked was King Lear. And in King Lear, the king says what Freud, in so many words, said about society. King Lear said this, and I'm quoting him: "When we are born, we cry that we have come to this great stage of fools. We cry that we have come to this great stage of fools." Both Freud and Shakespeare believed that society is often irrational. An example, perhaps an obvious example, isn't it interesting that in America, the best golfer in America, the best professional golfer in America, is more highly paid and more celebrated than the very best doctors, teachers, nurses, social workers, lawyers fighting for the poor and the oppressed? And isn't it interesting? What does the best golfer in America do to earn his money, to earn his celebrity? he puts a ball in a hole, or at least attempts to put a ball in a hole. And I think Freud would agree. Again, this is an example, a rather obvious one, of how society is irrational. The fact that a golfer can be so celebrated and become so wealthy, in contrast to so many people who make such valuable contributions to society every day, and were not nearly compensated, and were not compensated nearly as much, nor, in most cases, celebrated at all. Freud's lesson here is this: since society is often irrational and immoral, the solution is to learn to think for yourself. Freud would also agree with Thoreau that there is but little virtue in the action of the masses of men. Again, I think one could consider that to be another Freudian lesson. There is but little virtue in the actions of the masses of men. Freud, even during his lifetime, was very controversial. Alfred Adler, for example, a contemporary psychiatrist of Freud's, claimed that sex was not the primary cause of neurosis. Adler believed that people's feelings of inferiority was the main cause of neurosis, that people engaged in misguided attempts to deal with their feelings of inferiority, and this resulted in neuroses. Carl Jung, another contemporary of Freud, who later broke with Freud because of his differences with him, Jung said that sometimes neurosis is caused by inner sexual conflicts, often unconscious. But he said other times, Adler is right, that a neurosis can be caused by a person's misguided attempts to deal with his or her feelings of inferiority. And Jung went on to say that sometimes a neurosis has nothing to do with sex or feelings of inferiority. It could have to do with something that has just happened in someone's life, some trauma which a person has experienced. Jung also went on to disagree with Freud's idea that in trying to help a patient, one had to examine the patient's childhood. Jung said, yes, sometimes it's necessary to examine a patient's childhood, but other times, if the neurosis is not related to the person's childhood, one doesn't necessarily have to delve into a person's childhood to deal with the neurosis. Among Freud's present-day critics are Professor Adolf Grunbaum, who teaches at the University of Pittsburgh, and Professor Frank Cioffi, who teaches at the University of Kent in England. Both of these professors claim that Freud's ideas, including psychoanalysis, are untestable. They also claim that we cannot rely on anecdotal evidence which Freud and his followers provide. And what have some of Freud's present-day defenders said? Well, they claim there is some scientific evidence which tends to support some of Freud's ideas. For example, Dr. Alan Braun of the National Institutes of Health has done PET scans to come up with a map of the dreaming brain. And Dr. Braun says that the map is in some ways consistent with psychoanalytic theory. I think the most sensible evaluation of Freud comes from Harvard professor Alan Stone. Alan Stone is a professor of psychiatry at Harvard, and here's what he has to say about Freud, and I'm quoting Professor Stone. Plato, Hegel, Michelangelo, Da Vinci, Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, and Sartre helped to shape Western civilization and its conceptions of the human condition without any systematic proofs of their contentions, and so I suggest did Freud. What Professor Stone is saying, in essence, is that we don't demand proofs from Plato and Shakespeare and Da Vinci about their conceptions of human behavior, and that perhaps it's unfair to demand proofs from Freud, but that just as Shakespeare, Plato, Sartre, Da Vinci stimulate our thinking about life and human nature, so does Freud. What I'd like to do now is to recommend some books by Freud and about Freud that I think will provide further illumination about him. I strongly suggest that you read Freud's autobiography. It's a very short book. It's more about his ideas than his life. It's entitled An Autobiographical Study. The best book by Freud, I think, which provides a very good summary of his views, is a book he wrote late in life entitled Civilization and Its Discontents. It's really a short essay and is very easy to read. If you're interested specifically in Freud's views on sex, well, you should go to his book entitled 3 Essays on the Theory of Sexuality. 3 Essays on the Theory of Sexuality by Sigmund Freud. 2 very good biographies on Freud are the following. Generally considered to be the best biography of Freud is one written by Yale Professor Emeritus Peter Gay. It's entitled Freud, A Life for Our Time. If you wish to read a critical biography of Freud, I highly recommend Louis Breger's biography entitled Freud, Darkness in the Midst of Vision. Freud, Darkness in the Midst of Vision. And by the way, I mentioned before that Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, became a very famous child psychoanalyst. And if you wish to read a very good book about her, you might want to read a book entitled Anna Freud by Harvard professor Robert Coles. Before I close, I wish to remind you that I'll be teaching an evening course consisting of 6 sessions at the Staten Island Institute of Arts and Sciences beginning in September of 2005. And the theme will be love and what the great thinkers in philosophy, psychology, religion, and literature have said about love. And we'll talk about various forms of love: romantic love, love of humankind, self-love, friendship, etc. By the way, if you're interested in taking the course, I suggest you call Maria Fiorelli at the Staten Island Institute of Arts and Sciences. Her number is 718-727-1135, and her extension is 29. Finally, Henry David Thoreau reminds us that we are all artists. In Walden, Thoreau wrote the following: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."